In today's video, I'm going to show you exactly how I learned to stop racing thoughts going around in my head, and I'm also going to introduce a model of the mind which I developed myself, which can help us in understanding where these thoughts come from. Hi and welcome back to Mental Health Power. So racing thoughts is something that I think we've all experienced at some point. This is usually the experience of noticing that we have internal commentary going around and around in our head over and over again. And usually this is revolving around the same subjects. So let's say there's a situation we have and we're finding it difficult to accept or to overcome, or a problem we can't resolve. Now we may find ourselves having thoughts that go around and around over and over again, trying to either figure things out or just non-stop commenting on the situation. And this can be distressing, especially, for example, this usually happens, let's say, when we're falling asleep. And we find that we can't sleep because these thoughts go round and round in our head, and no matter how much we try and stop it, they don't stop. And the truth is, you can't actually stop these thoughts. And that's where I think a lot of the information about stopping thoughts comes from. Because every time you try and stop a thought, what you are doing is actually giving it energy. And every time you give energy by resisting it, because that's what stopping is, every time you resist it, you are actually making it continue in your mind. And this is where I think a lot of the traditional information can sometimes miss out on, where there's a lot of good information about managing thoughts, but really, this is the way I believe to approach it. And this is what's worked for me for many years now. So I also need to point out that when I refer to racing thoughts, I don't mean overthinking. I would see overthinking as when there's a particular situation and we believe that there is a lot more to the situation than there actually is, or when we're overcomplicating something when the answer is really simple. That's what I would refer to overthinking as, which is not what racing thoughts are. Racing thoughts is the act of your internal dialogue or monologue, or images that come up, or intuitive impressions going around in a loop over and over and over again, and they just don't stop. So to understand how to stop racing thoughts, really I should put this in quotations, a bit misleading. First, let's have a look at a model of the mind. Now, I understand that this model is very general, and I also accept that not everyone thinks in the same way. So this is very much based on my own thinking, but also based on my conversation with other people and how they think. So it's interesting that there are about 5 different ways people think. So you have, as I mentioned, the internal dialogue or monologue, so commentary going on. We also have images that come up. So when people say they're using their mind's eye, they're seeing images in their mind. That's another way of thinking. Sometimes we can have these intuitive feelings and impressions. And some people may not call that thinking, but I would still see it as a way of thinking because we use it to make judgments. And essentially it's information that we are being given, just in a different form. To understand how we stop racing thoughts, because I know we don't really stop them, let's have a look at a model of the mind. So this is essentially how I see the mind. It is based off, half of it is based off a generally accepted idea of how the mind works. The other half is my own idea. So the first half is to understand that the mind is split into 2 main parts, or can be seen as being split into 2 main parts. So the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So the conscious mind is what we experience pretty much all the time, except when we're asleep and dreaming. So when we're conscious, we essentially means that we're awake, and our conscious mind is where our traditional thinking happens. So when you notice your internal dialogue or monologue, when you notice images appear, when you're recalling memories, that's happening in your conscious mind. When you're thinking of things and calculating things, that's all happening in your conscious mind. And the subconscious makes up most of our mind, and it's the opposite. So it's actually hidden from our normal view. So when we sleep and we dream, that's when we experience the subconscious mind directly. And the subconscious mind also controls everything we don't have to think about. So all of your habits, all of your bodily processes, you don't have to do anything that happens automatically. That's being controlled by the subconscious. And the subconscious makes up apparently about 95% of our mind. So it's actually most of our mind. And it's what does, you could say, the heavy lifting, the back processing. The important thing also is that there's a third aspect. And this is what I believe is largely missed out in traditional psychology or therapy, or at least there isn't the mass awareness as I believe there should be. And that the third part is this here, which is the point of awareness. So we have thoughts that come into our mind or thoughts we create. So we could say thoughts that pop into our head, we can call passive thoughts. So we didn't necessarily actively create them. And thoughts that we actively created, we can say that they are active thoughts. And so this is the way I view my own thoughts. I don't think I've seen anyone else come up with it in this way, but I'm sure there are different models about this as well. So the important thing to note is that this third aspect of the mind, which is awareness, that's actually who we are. And so the first problem most of us have, humans, the problem we have is that we have thoughts and then we identify with the thoughts. So we have thoughts and then we believe that we are those thoughts. So you can imagine how many problems emerge from that first issue. But we have a large amount of people who are fully identified with whatever thoughts are coming into their head, whether they've created it or whether they've popped into their head. So the first problem is most of us have been indirectly taught or it was never realized that we are not our thoughts. And that's an extremely important thing to remember, that we are not our thoughts. What we are the observer of our thoughts. So we are this point of awareness which can view thoughts. And if you think about it, the fact that you can hear your own thoughts or view images in your mind, or you can identify and experience intuitive impressions in your mind, the fact that you can experience it means you're observing it in some way, which proves that you are not those thoughts because you're able to observe them. So you are this point here, the observer. This is the first principle you must always remember, because no matter what thoughts you create or where they come from, it's important that you remember that you are not them, because so many mental health problems are perpetuated because whatever thoughts come into our mind, whether they're negative or not, we believe that that's us. So that's the first point, that you are the point of awareness that views your thoughts. Second thing is, when you have thoughts that you have not created, these come from your subconscious mind. So if you ever had the experience where you're like, oh, I don't know why I've got music going around in my head, and you know you didn't actually actively create that in your mind, or you have images that just pop into your head and you don't know how that happened, or ideas that pop into your head, and you didn't actively create them, that's because they've come from your subconscious mind. So it's, the back processor. It's like if you have your computer or your phone, there are things happening in the background that you're not aware of. It's doing it automatically. That's where habits come from. So those kind of thoughts, these are what I would refer to as passive thoughts. So you didn't actively create them, they came passively from your subconscious. And why that happens is a bit long to get into, so that will be for another video. But just for now, understand that there are thoughts that you actively create, and there are thoughts that automatically and passively come from your subconscious. And you are the awareness that can view all of them. This means you don't actually have to actively create lots of the thoughts in your mind. So when it comes to stopping racing thoughts, a big issue is we have these passive thoughts coming in. So that's the part that we observe and we watch and think we can't control it. The thing that keeps these racing thoughts going, and they are passive thoughts, so you didn't create them, is that we start thinking and judging these thoughts that are racing about. So we're feeding it, and then it keeps going, it perpetuates. So what we need to do, once we firstly become aware of this commentary, because often our mind is two things can happen. We can observe things happening, like a situation or a person, and we may find our mind is automatically judging that person or situation. So it's commenting on it, saying things about it, and it's happening passively, but sometimes we can be actively doing it. So we can be actively creating thoughts. So it's important that we learn to just observe mindfully. So this is essentially a mindfulness practice. It's important we observe these thoughts that come in and identify, am I creating these thoughts? Or is it coming from my subconscious? Is it passively being created? The moment you can identify it, you want to stop creating thoughts. If you are actively trying to reduce racing thoughts, then you need to first stop the ones you are creating. And you do this by just learning to observe whatever thoughts are going around in your mind. And it's not easy, it takes time. But one way we can look at it is that, so this was meant to be my picture of a drop of water, a drop going on water. So the best way of thinking about the mind, one of the ways, is if you imagine the mind being a pool of water, and imagine the ripples being thoughts that are going around it. Every time you actively think about something or you actively create a thought in your mind, it's like adding another drop of water. So you add the water drop and then makes the ripples continue. The more you keep adding the drops, the more the ripples get more turbulent and turbulent. So what you really want to do, what people are doing, what I've done as well for many years, was we're trying to stop the turbulent waters by adding more water. And of course, that's just going to make it continue. So instead, how do you stop the ripples in the water? You just stop adding water, you just observe it, and eventually, gradually, the ripples start to slow down, the waves start to slow down, they get slower and slower, and they get smaller and smaller until eventually it calms down. That's the essence of meditation and mindfulness, where you just, from the act of observation, you stop feeding those racing thoughts. So the only reason why the subconscious continues to create these thoughts is because we're feeding active thoughts into it over and over again. And so by feeding it more and more of these water droplets, these thoughts, we keep it going. So the way you stop racing thoughts is you practice just observing the thoughts and not adding more onto them. So this is the step-by-step process of what I've done for many years and has always worked for me. And I must point out that it is a practice. It's something you do daily, just as if you wanted to learn to drive a car, if you wanted to ride a bike, learn a new sport, if you want to learn a language, anything like that. You can't do it for a week and then say, oh, I didn't get any results, it didn't work. This is going to be something that's going to take time, but it's 100% worth it. And I think every human being on the planet should already know this, and we taught this at school. How to use your mind should be the first thing that we're taught, but for whatever reason, we're not. So the first thing you want to do is start focusing on your breathing. And this is probably going to be the first thing I say for most of the solutions. And this is because when you focus on your breathing, so your breathing can be controlled by both your subconscious and your conscious mind. So you can do it automatically without thinking about it. And at that point, your subconscious mind is controlling it. Or you can consciously do it. So you can manually take over and start breathing. The fact that I've said that now, you'll probably now start consciously breathing, right? Because now that you're thinking about it, your subconscious mind goes, oh, well, now you take over. But later on, you'll forget and you'll realize you're breathing automatically. So you want to start focusing on your breathing first and foremost. And this is because you're taking a point of awareness from your mind and putting it into somewhere on your body. And it's giving your mind something to do. You're giving a point of awareness something to focus on. So while you're focusing on your breathing, you want to gradually make them a bit deeper each time. Don't force it. And there are many different breathing techniques and timings you can look up online. You can try different ones. Everyone's going to have slightly different purposes. So once you've spent a couple of minutes focusing on your breathing, you then want to start counting in your head. So some people count the breaths they're taking. Typical one is to breathe in for 4, hold for 7, breathe out for 8, but you can do whatever version you want. I've done another video specifically on anxiety and a breathing technique where I go further into how you can use breathing to manage anxiety in the moment. So you can check that out. But for now, while you're focusing on your breathing and gradually breathing slower and slower, you then want to start counting in your head. So you can count from 1 to 100, 100 to 1, you count in 2s and 3s, whatever you want. The purpose is that by doing this, you're creating active thoughts that are totally neutral and have nothing to do with the passive thoughts that are being created, the racing thoughts. So this means while your subconscious mind is creating these thoughts of trying to solve the problem or worrying about whatever the issue is, you're just not paying attention to it, and you're for the time being creating active thoughts that are totally neutral. So they're just about counting. So you can be counting 99, 98, 97, whatever you want, and you just focus on that and your breathing. So you can bring a point of attention between those two, and naturally your mind will go back to these passive thoughts that are going around or racing around. That's fine, just let that happen and then gently bring your point of attention back to your counting and your breathing. So the more you do that for a couple more minutes, and then you want to focus your point of attention, so your awareness, on your surroundings. So what sounds can you hear? What feelings can you feel? What colors can you see? What lights are there? That kind of thing. And again, when your point of attention goes back to these racing thoughts, let it be. Bring your point of attention back now to these 3 things. So now your point of attention is moving from 1 to 3 things. So you can see what we're doing is we're training our mind to not keep going back to this, because that's what we've done for probably most of our lives, right? So this is almost like training a muscle, but it's the opposite. You're not training the muscle to contract, as in to do something that's difficult, like heavy lifting. You're actually training it to let go. So it's like reverse exercise almost, it's letting go. And so as this is happening, as your point of attention is moving between these 4 things, your breathing, your counting, your surroundings, and the racing thoughts, inevitably, when your attention goes back to these racing thoughts, these thoughts that are coming in, whether you're actively creating them or they're passively coming in, just observe it. Don't judge it. Let it be. Almost like if there's just a person talking to you and you're just observing it, but you're not talking back, you're not judging it, you're just observing. That's it. That's what you want to do. And what you want to do is whenever you notice yourself creating judgments or thoughts about the thoughts you're having or whatever situation is, again, just start practicing not creating those thoughts. And I know that's a bit of a weird thing to say because we're so used to those thoughts going around our head. But the more you try to do this, you'll notice that you'll have gaps in between thoughts the more you practice it. So you'll have moments where there are no thoughts. And that's ultimately what you're doing. You're learning to let go of thinking. And this is not a straightforward practice at first because nobody's really been taught this unless they've gone to seek it out or if they were born in a culture where this is a normal practice. So it's about persisting. The success will come from persisting. Failure is normal as part of success. So you want to keep persisting with this as a daily practice. Now, you might want to set aside some specific time in the day or maybe in the morning and the night to practice this at first, so you don't have any distractions, because I know this can be tough to do if you're doing it during the day. But eventually, as you get better and better at doing it at these set moments, you may find your mind just automatically starting to do these things, because we have mental habits as well as physical habits. So in the same way that you learn to throw a ball really far by practicing, this practice is a mental habit. So the more you practice letting go of these active thoughts, the more you practice just observing, it becomes automatic gradually over time. What can massively help as well to stop racing thoughts is just writing them down. So I find a lot of the times if I notice my mind is racing, it's because it thinks it's trying to work something out, and it thinks if it keeps thinking about it over and over again, that somehow it's going to solve it. But usually, if it's been a couple of hours and it still is doing the same thing over and over again, it's probably not going to figure it out. And so what you want to do is, if you have all these thoughts going around and if they're creating anxiety, just write them all down. And I find that often that helps it to stop, because it's like it's told our mind, well, I'm not going to forget what I was thinking about. I'm not going to forget the problem now. So you write it all down. And I find the more I did this in the past, the less these thoughts came about, because if I wanted to think about it, I'd tell myself, well, I can come back and worry about this later by opening this book. And yeah, you need to have patience with these practices, because if we've been in the habit of doing the opposite, then this is not really about learning, it's more about unlearning. So you're essentially overwriting the program that was there before. And this is because you're not really learning to do something. Because you're undoing what you've learned, what you are really doing is being. And I know that sounds a bit odd, but when we're not doing something, if we sat and did nothing, what we are doing is existing, so we are just being. So by doing this practice more and more, you're not doing mental activity, you're letting go of it. So you're really focused on being. So this is a being practice, not a doing practice. And this is because thinking about things over and over again doesn't necessarily resolve things. In fact, I'm sure we've all had the experience where we've forgotten about a problem, and then all of a sudden, just bam, out of the blue, a solution comes in our mind, right? So you don't always have to think about problems to resolve them. Sometimes when we give our conscious mind a rest, our subconscious mind will figure it out on its own. And so when you let go, often answers can come to us. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a big part of the problem of racing thoughts is our identification with the thoughts, so the belief that we are those thoughts. So often, if we are very emotionally attached to a problem, then it's almost like we want to keep those thoughts going, because it's almost like we think if we let it go, it's telling ourselves we don't care. And that's because of an identification with the thoughts. So remind yourself, and again, through these practices you'll see that you are not those thoughts, you are the observer of the thoughts. And another thing that can happen is when you notice the judgments that can come about of your own thoughts, don't judge your own judgments. So there can be this issue where you end up in a negative feedback loop where you're observing your thoughts, and maybe there's something about them you don't like. So then you create a thought to judge that thought, and then you start judging yourself for judging judging the thought, which is a mouthful, but that can happen. So just learn to not judge your thoughts. And so with this practice, and again, it's not something that will happen overnight, it can take a lot of practice. Some people notice quite a quick change. It depends on your own mind. Doing this as a daily practice absolutely changed my life, because through doing this, you control your mind and it doesn't control you. And so that's today's video. If you have any questions, please comment below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.